here's what's coming up in the Luncheon Society. We're doing something completely off the normal events of stuff. We'll have lunch with Haley Mills coming up, who's a former Disney actress. And then we're going to have John Callis will be back for his annual Mars Luncheon, which is always fantastic. For those who are not familiar with the Luncheon Society, it's a series of gatherings that before the pandemic took place in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Boston. And I think we may stay online here for the long term because we're able to get a great group of people together, and we're able to do it in such a way where I don't have to take a overnight to Manhattan or to Kennedy or to Los Angeles or to Boston. So that's a good thing. And also too, you know, we have all sorts of things that are planned for the next next year. So just watch your email and come on and join us when you can. Yeah, it's just great. I'm really excited that we have Marvin joining us today. I mean, the book Assignment Russia is fantastic in the sense here's a young man thrown into the middle of the Cold War. In fact, the high point of the Cold War, when we were dealing with crises in Berlin, crises throughout a various number of touch points globally that could have spiraled into something horrible. We could have looked down the gun barrel of a nuclear confrontation that could have really turned into a nuclear exchange. And what was great about it is that, you know, perhaps because of the reputation of CBS, Marvin and the skill set that Marvin had, we got the straight view of what was going on in the Soviet Union in a way that other news organs and other journalists couldn't deliver. And in reading the book, which was a lot of fun, right here, it kind of gives us a good first-person experience of what it was like to go over there. Not just the stuff of dealing with Khrushchev, but also dealing with the fact you're in a bed that's way too small and having his bed shipped over from his family as if it was airmail. And so what I want to do is just we'll jump into this. For those that haven't been around, we do Marvin will talk for about 5 or 10 minutes. And after that, we'll just open up the Q&A and we'll go for the 90 minutes. And that'll be fun. And with that, Marvin, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bob, very, very much. And thanks to all of you for joining. I am honored, truly, to have been invited and to have an opportunity of sharing some of my thoughts about Assignment Russia. The book is my 17th, it's a memoir. And as Bob indicated, it focuses essentially on the time between 1957 and 1961. It's part of a program here at Brookings in Washington to do a 3-part memoir. The first part has already been done. It's called The Year I Was Peter the Great. This book, Assignment Russia, is the middle book. And the third book is going to be the period from 1961 until 1964 when Khrushchev was kicked out of power. And the 3 of them will comprise really an American reporter working in Khrushchev's Russia at a time of extreme danger. And yet there were moments of levity. And certainly for someone like me who used to teach Russian history, the idea of being able to live in Russia, to meet Russians, and actually to meet and deal with Khrushchev was quite remarkable. The book is in 3 parts very quickly. The first, not parts, but themes. The first theme is, Bob has already talked about it, being a young American journalist in the middle of the Cold War based in Moscow. The second theme is that if you were based in Moscow, one of the things that was just under the surface, but terribly important, was the beginning of the rupture between Russia and China, which before had become the Sino-Soviet alliance. And because of China's huge number and because of Russia's nuclear power, would compose a combination that would be deadly if in competition with the United States. And the third theme is really Nikita Khrushchev himself. I was very fortunate to have met Khrushchev in 1956, and Khrushchev gave me this funny title of Peter the Great. And the reason for that is kind of an amusing story. We were at the July 4th party in Moscow in 1956. Khrushchev arrived with the entire Politburo. I was given, because I spoke Russian, Marshal Zhukov, the defense minister, to look after him. We spent 40 minutes together. Khrushchev then beckoned for us to come because he was ready to leave. And he looked up at me. I'm 6'3", he's 5'6". He looks up and he says, "How tall are you?" And a brainstorm hit me. To this day. I don't know how or why. I said, "I'm 3 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great," at which point Khrushchev burst into laughter, thought it was the funniest story he'd ever heard. And from that time on, always referred to me as Peter the Great, which, as a journalist seeking access to the man who represented the single largest nuclear threat to the United States, that was a heck of an asset to have. And so I was able to get an exclusive interview with Khrushchev. It was my first, quote, scoop, and that was in Paris in May 1960 at a summit meeting that did not quite happen because Khrushchev refused to go along with certain terms that President Eisenhower had laid down. And the two of them were in a collision. And it was my gut feeling that if I could be at the Soviet embassy at 7 in the morning, when I figured he would leave the embassy for his morning walk, I'd have a crew there and we'd have an interview. And that is exactly what happened. On the way, I bought him some croissant in a boulangerie, which is just down the corner. That's a telephone, and I just give him a freshly baked croissant. And you should have seen the look on his Slavic face as he bit into that and kept on saying, "Очень вкусно, да, очень вкусно." Really, really delicious. And that led to the interview where Khrushchev, in effect, said there was not going to be a summit because he demanded that Eisenhower apologize for the U-2 incident. And Khrushchev, of course, had the goods on the United States. We were flying over his territory. That was illegal. He not only shot down the plane, the U-2, he got a hold of Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot, and he was alive and well and appeared at a trial in August of 1960. And Eisenhower could not duck responsibility, accepted that, but that in effect killed his trip to Russia, which was supposed to have taken place in June of 60. Khrushchev had built this massive golf course for the president. No one ever got to use it. It was one of these things that was a lost opportunity. And this theme about Khrushchev and being able to work with him, not work with him, but cover him, was a remarkable opportunity for me. I was very grateful for it and happy to take any questions that you have.
Okay, I'll jump in first.
By the way.
I'm sorry, I'll jump in first and we'll just just go to the chat function and just throw your name in and we'll just kind of run along that route. Here's my question. It's the question that I asked many, many years ago when we had a Luncheon Society with Ted Sorensen, and there Dan Rather was with us. And it goes to the issue of making decisions within a framework of time. For example, if something happened at the Berlin Wall, if there was as the Berlin Wall crisis began to mushroom, Dan Rather would tell us that you had to get the film to Tempelhof, get it on a 707, either chartered or a Pan Am flight. then it would fly to New York. Then it would be rushed from Idlewild to CBS headquarters. Then the film would be cut, it would be prepared, and then commentary would take place. But there was a time of roughly 12 or 16 hours before the film was made and before it ended up on television, where planners had an opportunity to sit back and not react, but reflect upon what was happening so that they could respond. And my question, in this 24/7 news culture, if a Cuban Missile Crisis were to happen today, would there be a knee-jerk response of retaliation that might be too powerful for senior heads to prevail?
Bob, that's a question that is not over the plate. It kind of is off on a corner on a curveball.
Okay.
But let me try to answer it as we now live in a totally different mindset. It is different because of time. It is different because of communications. In early June of 1960, to give you a sense of how different it was back then, if you were a correspondent, as I was in Moscow, and you had the privilege of covering Boris Pasternak's funeral, he had just died. He had been given a Nobel Prize for Literature. The Russian government would not allow him to go to Oslo to accept it. And after 2 years of deep mourning, he passed away. And tens of thousands of Russians went to Peredelkino, a small town outside of Moscow, where he lived. The entire area was flooded with people, and his casket was brought down on the shoulders of his sons and walked across a field to a churchyard, and there in front of 3 birch trees, the gravesite, and his casket was put there. I was there with a camera. We were not able to have a cameraman. I was the correspondent and also the cameraman. I was able to take pictures of this entire procession. I had the sound. It was a terrific story, not from the point of view of exclusives or anything like that. As a human phenomenon, this great writer, dead because he couldn't receive his prize.
Mm-hmm.
All right, how do you get that footage to New York? Dan was talking about footage arriving at Idlewild. How would you get it to Idlewild if the government would not allow you to ship the film out of the country? It was illegal to ship exposed footage outside of the country without the permission of the Soviet government. The Soviet government would not give that permission. So what do? You had to find what we called a pigeon. You had to find somebody who was leaving Moscow on a flight and going to the West, somewhere in the West, gutsy enough to take your footage and either put it in her purse or put it in his briefcase, put it in his pocket somewhere and get it through Soviet customs. If they had caught you taking the film out illegally, they could have arrested you. They could have thrown you into the plane. But the gutsiness of our pigeon carried the footage to London, at which point I told the woman who was carrying this footage for me, I said, I'm going to get you Eric Severeid. He is going to meet you at the airport and get the footage from you. That was totally untrue. Eric would never go out to the airport to get the footage, but I had to get the story out. Now, in London, the story got lost and my big pictorial scoop was gone. But if I had been lucky, somebody would have then sent it to New York. It would have been picked up, and then Dan's story about what happens after that look, it would have meant that I had an additional day, as it were, to think about the story, to call people, to get some depth,
right,
then lay it in as a track over the footage that would have arrived in New York. We had to do this whenever we had a story. It was agonizing, it was frustrating, but it was also part of the excitement and the challenge of being a Western correspondent in the Soviet Union at a period of the Cold War when you had a story to tell and they didn't want you to tell it. You also had to go through censorship.
Yeah.
I'll give you another story about the censor. All of our copy leaving Moscow had to be cleared by a Soviet censor. So you were trying to find words that would have meaning to an American ear or eye, but would slip past the Russian censor. And once they took us off to Minsk in Belarus, and they told us that we were watching the demobilization of the Soviet Red Army, which was, of course, nonsense, straight propaganda. And what we witnessed was 20 Russian soldiers take their rifles, hold it up in the air, and throw it on the ground and say, an end to war. Great. How do you tell the American people that this was nonsense? And what I said at the time, as I remember, was 10 American journalists were taken for a ride today, this time to Minsk, where they were told blah, 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 blah. But the phrase taken for a ride meant, I hoped, to an American ear, hey, buddy, this is all a lot of baloney. But the censor didn't know the phrase, so we got through.
That's great. I mean, it gives us an idea of what, the challenges you had from behind the Iron Curtain as opposed to somebody in West Berlin. Let's see, we have Steve Schlesinger, we have Tim Farley, and of course, if Gary and Mike Dukakis and others want to ask, please go for it. Throw your name in and we'll go from there. So Steve, you're up. And there you go.
Yeah, I have a kind of strange sort of question, but since Khrushchev was considered a reformer in Soviet times, what do you think he would have made of Gorbachev? I mean, after all, Gorbachev himself was considered a reformer. The times were different, but I'm wondering how he would have seen the Gorbachev phenomenon.
Well, that's a wonderful question because the two of them were very close, not person to person, knowing each other, however, generationally very close. What I mean is that Khrushchev was in office from 1955 roughly until 1964. In that period of time, a new generation, in the reform movement that Khrushchev started, a new generation rose. In that new generation was Gorbachev and people like him. And Gorbachev always believed that it was Nikita Khrushchev's reforms in 1956 and 57. They sort of stopped after a while, but his reforms in that period of time gave life to the idea that the Soviet Union could be continued as a communist state, but a state that performed, that gave what they claimed they were trying to do, put some reality behind that. And there was genuine reform that did take place. Many political prisoners were released. The budget was redone so that it wasn't all to the military, it was also to civilian production. So he tried very hard to get going, but he was forced really to back off by conservative pressures and by Chinese pressures, oddly enough. But Gorbachev always looked back to Khrushchev and to the Khrushchev period as the birthplace for the kind of reform of communism that he thought he was implementing. One of the things about Khrushchev and Gorbachev, which brought them together ideologically, was that each one thought that you could reform a communist dictatorship and you would emerge with communism, but with a human face, so to speak. Kind of thing that Tito tried to do in Yugoslavia and succeeded to some extent. Gorbachev was brought down in a way by the same forces that brought down Khrushchev. There is locked into that system and sadly into Russian history, a retarding pressure that kind of sits on creativity. I've met in my time in Russia, I've lived there for 5 years and traveled there 25 times at least. I met many Russians. They are, for the most part, I mean, there are awful people too, but for the most part, they're decent. They want the kinds of things that you want. They want an education, family, this, that, and the other. But they want order. And their desire for order opens the possibility of politicians coming in with a structure that they're going to put on top to get the order that the Russian people prefer. They prefer the order and the ability to prosper, and their musical minds, their literary minds, which are phenomenal, to give them energy to burst forth. But there is always a time, it happened with Khrushchev and it's happened with Gorbachev, and it will happen also with Putin. And that is that the Russian people at a certain point will have had enough. How they express that, I don't know. I mean, every 100 years or so in Russian history, there's an explosion and you have a kind of revolution. It happened in the 19th century, it happened in the 16th century. Will it happen in the 21st? Who knows? But that's the sad part of the Russian experience. But thanks for that question.
Tim Farley, you're next, and throw your names into the question basket, into the chat, or just raise your hand and we'll get everybody up.
Thank you, Bob. Listening to your story about Khrushchev and just the film and the footage alone, and all the intrigue on getting the film out of Russia. In your experience, in your 5 years there, did you ever personally feel vulnerable or threatened, or, I hate to say this, scared for your life?
The answer is no, but I'm not a hero, and let me explain. One of the things that I tried very hard to do in both of these memoir books is to convey as honestly as I could what it was like living in a dictatorship when you are not a Russian citizen. You are a foreigner. You have a certain respect that goes with being a foreigner in a somewhat backward country. They look up to you. I mean, think about one of the things that you'll find in the early part of Assignment Russia is an effort to convey this idea that I was there 15 years after the end of World War II. During World War II, the Russians lost an estimated 30 million people in the war. During World War II, the United States sent a great deal of goods, of clothing, of food, through Murmansk, going around the top of the Soviet Union, coming down in ships, unloading it, and very wisely writing USA all over these packages. The Russian people, when I arrived at that time, and it's in both of these books, they remembered America as a friend, as somebody who helped us when we needed it. During World War II, when we fought fascism, also in the Russian mind, they're the only ones who really beat the Nazis. I mean, we were there and we did our thing and all of that, but they really did most of it. And because they lost so many people, it overwhelms their logic every now and then because of the pain and the sacrifice. But they remember the US. And so as an American in Russia, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 63, I was there at a time when, as an American, I was respected. I was, in effect, honored, though no honor was due me at all. I was a reporter. So your question fascinates me because you would think that in a dictatorship, a communist dictatorship, you would really be under the gun yourself. I was as a reporter. You had to work very hard to get your story. As I already indicated, it was incredibly hard to get film out of the country. But the KGB, the Secret Service in Russia, was so intent on finding out which Russian I talked to so they could get the Russian, not me. They weren't out to get me. They were out to get the Russian I talked to. And that put an extra burden on me, which I try, maybe unsuccessfully, to explain in Assignment Russia. I always had to have in my mind that if I was doing a story based on something a Russian or a couple of Russians told me, as opposed to getting it officially from the government, I had to be very careful that I never implicated them in any way. So sometimes I would get a story and I wouldn't run it. Not because it wasn't a story, but because I didn't want to get the Russian into trouble. That was an extra burden that you walked around with as an American correspondent in Russia during the Cold War. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Fascinating insight. Thank you.
Don Callis, you're up next. You're on.
Yes. Thank you, Marvin, for taking my question, and thank you for your many decades of service. Perhaps I'm not quite the student of history I should be, but I was wondering if you could shed some light on the Gary Powers incident that, Eisenhower knew we were flying over Soviet territory, and he knew he had this summit coming up with Khrushchev. There's a lot of speculation and conspiracies about why Eisenhower didn't suspend those overflights prior to the summit. But I was wondering if you had any insights or thoughts as to why Eisenhower continued with those overflights, knowing that it could be discovered and put the summit at risk.
The reason, as he explained it, as a number of his people explained it, and in an odd way, as the Russians understood it, Eisenhower and Khrushchev were simply doing what you did during the Cold War. You sneaked a look at what it is that the Russians were doing. They knew we were doing that. They knew from the start that we were doing it. One of the reasons is they could see us, and they were doing the same thing to us. They were doing it in their way. We were doing it in our way. We each knew what the other was doing. There's a Russian word, blut, which is a wonderful word, which during the Cold War would be used a lot more than it is today, but under Putin, it's used a lot now. I lied to you. You know I'm lying to you. And yet we continue our discussion knowing that the foundation of our discussion is one big lie. And that was in Ike's mind, and that was very much in Khrushchev's mind. When Khrushchev, in this interview that I did with him in Paris in May 1960, Khrushchev said, "You violated our territory." And it's not my role to argue with the source, he was saying, you violate, I could have said to him, and you violate our territory. But he was given his opportunity to state his case. Is there going to be a summit? No. And the reason is, you, the United States, violated our territory. Why was that so important for Khrushchev? Number one, he wanted the record to show that we were the bad guys, and he was a good guy. He favored peace, and Eisenhower was in charge of espionage. What was fascinating was that when the Paris summit officially died on May 18th, the Soviet press, as though ignited by a magical flame, suddenly everything in the Soviet press was filled with Eisenhower, the tyrant, Eisenhower, the spy, Eisenhower, this and that. Up until that day, the Soviet press was filled with praise of Eisenhower, the great World War II hero. America in those days, they helped us. The next day, he's a monster. Khrushchev also was being attacked by highly conservative people within the Kremlin, that he was reaching out to the West too far. His idea of peaceful coexistence violated a sense of what some hardline communists believed ought to be the position of the Soviet Union. But under Khrushchev was getting soft. And the Chinese slipped in there smartly, diabolically, whatever adverb you like, in order to nail Khrushchev. And in order to say that the Chinese form of communism is the true form of communism, not this silly stuff that Khrushchev was doing with Eisenhower. Is that helpful? I'm sorry.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before we go to Ben Bradley, just a quick question. I'm going to build on something Tim had said earlier. Most of the people who were in senior level, I won't say senior level positions in the Kremlin during the 1960s were themselves middle to junior officers in the Russian army, or they had some element in the fight against Hitler on the Russian front. How did that experience of absorbing 20 to 30 million dead really impact how they looked at nuclear weapons as a defensive and offensive platform?
The most important, first of all, somebody like Khrushchev, for example, or Brezhnev, they were politicians from the very beginning. But during the war, they were put into the army for two reasons. One, they were to provide ideological fervor to the effort to defeat the Nazis. The second, that they were the best people in the Soviet Union that Stalin had. So he put those best people in charge of the military. What they had in mind from that time on was that World War II was so formative an experience that the Russians had lost so many people that could never happen again. That was the philosophical and political framework in which they viewed policy. So when Khrushchev came along with his policy of peaceful coexistence with the West, most of the leadership went along with him because they didn't want to have any argument with the West. They wanted an opportunity to build communism as they thought it should be built. The fact that that was totally unrealistic, that took courage to acknowledge. And that is something that Khrushchev had, and later on something that Gorbachev had.
Ben Bradley, you're up.
Hello, Marvin, and
Hi, Ben. Hi.
Congratulations on the book. Look forward to reading it.
Thank you. Congratulations on yours as well.
Okay. You don't see the danger of nuclear war in the news hardly at all anymore. I believe we have extended the New START treaty with Russia until 2026. But to what extent do you think limiting the dangers of nuclear war is a political priority, both for us and for them?
Fabulous question. My gut feeling is that, let me break it down now and say what the Russians are thinking, and then I'll try to figure out what America is thinking. That is more puzzling to me than what it is that the Russians are thinking. The Russians, as I was saying a moment ago, regard World War II as the vision of the horror of war. And no Russian family ever forgets that. And if they do forget it, they are reminded of it time and time again. What the Russians try very hard to do is to think that they would like normalcy. They would like to be able to return to a time they never experienced, but they imagined, without war, where you could, your kids live well, you could have a home, you could have all of the things that the ideology of communism promised but never delivered. That put in their minds the initial thought of the horror of any kind of war. Add then the dimension of nuclear weapons. And then you get into an area where the Russian geniuses working on that issue are very similar to the Americans working on the same issue. They know about the horrors, they know what is involved in building the weapons, they know what could happen with the weapons. It is behind an effort to get the Iranians, for example, not to have those weapons. It dominates strategic thinking. But I have to say, Ben, I do not think that it influences strategic thinking. I think it is beyond their capacity to absorb the reality of a nuclear war into their thinking today. I could be wrong about that, but I continue to try to see as many people as I can. But as a matter of age, as I used to have it. But my gut feeling is that it's the same as it was, that the idea of nuclear war is so large, horrible a thought that it's distant. It's off there someplace and not really connected to us in a real way. We live on an assumption that only an idiot, a madman, would use a nuclear weapon, but there are madmen around. And any number of them could possibly acquire a nuclear weapon. I keep on thinking, for example, Ben, of a story like Pakistan today. Pakistan is ridden with terrorist groups. They're all over the place. Some of them in open space. People know exactly where they live and who they are. And there is a corrupt government that has been there now since the beginning of the state. And they acquire a kind of cooperative spirit because one is connected to the other. But supposing one thing that happens now is that the Taliban, which lives in both Pakistan and Afghanistan, in fact, the ISI in Pakistan intelligence probably created the Taliban that is now governing in Afghanistan. Supposing the Taliban, the Talibs as they're called, living in Pakistan, are inspired by what has just happened in Afghanistan to make a move against the Pakistani government to acquire the estimated 165 nuclear warheads that Pakistan has. That nightmare exists and has existed in presidential thinking for a long time. what happens if terrorists acquire nuclear weapons? What happens to this world? That then takes your question and makes it real rather than hypothetical.
Right, right. Good point.
Terrifying, I think, really.
And we'll go to Michael Werner and Gillian Sorensen.
Good afternoon, Mr. Kalb. Thank you for being with us. Many years ago, and I think in a book by David Schonbrunn, I read about an incident where either you or your brother were live on some kind of a broadcast from Moscow on a very late break, very rapidly developing situation. And whoever it was of the two of you who was reporting said something that was slightly out of step with the latest developments in this late breaking story.
Yeah.
Does that ring a bell with you?
Oh, yes, I could tell you that.
It's stuck in my mind. I've dined down on it for years, and I guess I'm not nuts. So if you could share it with us, I think people.
No, what happened at that time was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And David Schorr was at that time the CBS Washington bureau chief. I was in Moscow, and it was on a Sunday morning that the Russians announced that they were withdrawing their missiles. That was the deal. That was the second letter that Khrushchev sent to the president on that very crucial Friday, Saturday of that week of the missile crisis. I was in the Central Telegraph in Moscow. I had been tipped off that there was to be a major bulletin. When I heard there was a certain guy named Levitan whose voice, when you heard it on Moscow radio, indicated that it was to be a phenomenally important announcement. The minute I heard his voice, I knew it was very big and it was either war or they're pulling out the missiles. And I had an open line to New York, and I was feeding the Russian announcement to New York. I knew Russian, I was translating as we went along. And I told the editor in New York, the minute I heard the announcer say that Russian missiles would be withdrawn from Cuba, I did say that Khrushchev caved. I used that verb. The Russians caved. I thought it was right then. I think it's right now. Kennedy heard the broadcast, and he had Salinger, the press officer, call Schonbrunn, who got on the circuit with me in Moscow and said something like, he never said the president, but something like, a serious, very important man in Washington feels that you shouldn't use the verb caved and don't use that anymore. And I guessed it was the president, but that was not the key thing for me. What was key was whether I had made a mistake, whether I had overstated it. And in my judgment at that time, the Russians caved. I would say it again. Kennedy didn't like it, but that was not the first time that presidents did not approve of words that I used.
Did you somehow then retract it or put a softer buzz on it as you?
Well, no, they asked me to put a softer buzz on it, but how do you put a softer buzz on that story? The Russians moved missiles into Cuba. The president took action. The Russians decided to move the missiles out. Now, they have argued since then that there was a deal that we were going to pull our missiles out of Turkey. Kennedy had decided to move the missiles out of Turkey anyway. That was not a swap one for the other. The Russians used it as a swap because it eased the criticism directed at Khrushchev for having caved. I suppose we could have an interesting discussion about that, but that is what I thought at the time.
Okay, thank you very, very much.
Welcome.
Gillian, you're up.
Thank you, Bob and Mr. Kalb. Can you hear me?
Oh, I do indeed.
Okay, good. This is so interesting. You've spoken a good bit about Khrushchev and Eisenhower. Would you reflect a little more on Khrushchev and Kennedy and how their relationship changed over the several meetings that they had?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and it's very much the tail end of Assignment Russia. It's very much the last 100 pages or so where I deal with the period the tail end of 60 and then 1961. Khrushchev was in 1960, wherever we traveled, whatever interview I was able to get with him, he was obsessed with the election in 1960. Why? Because he didn't get anywhere with Eisenhower at the Paris summit that never happened in May. He was under attack and he knew that. And for him, maybe this new guy, Kennedy, would be much better than Nixon as the president of the United States. So every time before the election in 1960, whenever Khrushchev saw me, and I'm sure other American reporters, he would always ask, what's going on with the campaign? And I once got him into a conversation about the two of them, Nixon and Kennedy. And he said he didn't like Nixon. He was a cold warrior. He didn't think he could get anywhere with him. It would probably be a continuation of the worst aspects of the Cold War. Well, I said, what about Kennedy, supposing he became president? He said, you know, I don't know him. I want to learn. I've asked Gromyko for information. I've asked my ambassador, Menshikov, to give me information about this Senator Kennedy. And they all give me information. He's very smart, he's very rich, but I still don't get him. What do you think? And I said, no, it's not important what I think. What do you think? And he said, I met him only once, very briefly, on Capitol Hill during an also brief visit, during my 1959 visit. And I met him and he seemed so young, so inexperienced. I said, did that mean that you could, I use the Russian expression with the equivalent in English, that you could take him to the cleaners, that you could take advantage of him? He said, I don't want to say that. I don't want to say that, but he's very young and he looks very inexperienced. Would you prefer someone you know, even though he's a hardliner, or someone you don't know? Could be anything. And he said, well, maybe. I said, in other words, Nixon over Kennedy? And he seemed to imply yes. During their first meeting together in Vienna, it's a very interesting story, also says something about the Russian psyche and how bad their information was about the United States. The second meeting took place at the American Embassy. Kennedy was the host. Kennedy was seated when Khrushchev was brought into the room. Kennedy stood up to shake his hand. After the meeting, Khrushchev boasted that an American millionaire stood up to shake hands with Nikita Sergeyevich. That is how powerful I am. That's the greatness of the Soviet Union. Absolute drivel, but that was what was in his mind. And Kennedy, at that point, spoke to James Reston of the New York Times and said, we're going to have a very cold winter.
Before we go to the next question, I want to open this one up a little bit to both Gary Hart and Michael Dukakis, as well as to Jonathan Alter and Ben to a certain extent. I think Ben could really chime in here, and it's this. Based on what we know now, is it possible that Gorbachev could have found some way to survive politically, could have found some way to make it beyond the challenges he faced at the end, where the country basically went out of business? And I'll open this one up because I'm curious what the outcome might have been had he been able to survive.
I would love to hear what Mike says, Gary Hart, please.
Gary, do you want to take it?
Well, 2 or 3 observations. First of all, for those of us who followed Mr. Kalb and his journalism before we got to Washington, it is a privilege and honor to see you again.
Thank you.
Second, Bob, about half the people on this discussion are sometime authors. So when you have an author, you're featuring an author, which you've done for about 30 years. Don't flash the book like that. Hold it. We can see it.
There we go. There we go.
Hey, wait a minute, Gary. Is this what you mean?
That's called self-promotion. Third, Mr. Kalb, I had incredible experiences with Mikhail Gorbachev, and I am still in touch with him. I spent a week as his guest in Moscow, December 1987. And it was supposed to be a photo op. We were in discussion for 4 hours.
Oh.
And then Shevardnadze the next day for another 4 hours. Michael, I'm sure will remember this was, if you look at the dates, this was at a time when there were a few people in America who thought I might have a chance at the presidency. Didn't work out that way. Did for Michael. Michael got much closer than I did. But I came back from that experience and gave speeches, not to very much publicity, saying the Cold War is over. Mikhail Gorbachev said to me, now, I understand you're not supposed to take Soviets and Russian Soviets at their word, but he said, as far as we're concerned, the Cold War is over. We're not going to do this anymore. And that's when you get into all the Star Wars argument and back and forth. I think Jack Matlock has the best of that argument as to who ended the Cold War. Separate issue. But I think as it played out into the Clinton administration, we missed an enormous opportunity to bring Russia into the West in a whole lot of ways. It would have required subtle diplomacy. It would have required conservatives in America to swallow hard, and it would have taken a good deal of time. But that's what Gorbachev's plan was. He wanted to invest his nation's wealth in education, in health, in agriculture, in technology. And then finally, subsequently, I ended up 2 years later leading an American telephone company in negotiations with the post-Gorbachev, Gorbachev and then post-Gorbachev, Ministry of Telecommunications, to modernize the Soviet telephone system. And we were at that for 15 years.
Wow.
And it was to build a dual fiber optic cable all the way across the Soviet Union. That was going to be the backbone of the new post-Cold War Soviet economy. But it was squelched by an organization called the Coordinating Committee, COCOM. And that was an adjunct of NATO whose members agreed not to transfer high technology to the Soviet Union. Every member of NATO was in favor of this project, except two: Great Britain and the United States. And the official of the United States who put the kibosh on it was Secretary of Defense Richard Cheney. We could have had access to the entire Soviet telephone system.
Jeez.
Marvelous, wonderful
Michael.
story. Wonderful story. Also, I'd be fascinated about, before we go too far afield there, I'm curious also, Michael Dukakis, please give us your judgment.
You're on mute, Mike. There you go.
I've been enjoying this immensely, but for some reason these days I'm very, very, very concerned about our relationship with China.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And hi there. Kitty Dukakis has just arrived. It's okay. Let it go. I turned it off. Okay. I'm talking to these guys, huh? Okay. Say hi to the former First Lady here.
Hey.
Hi.
And I don't want to go too far afield, Marvin, but I really am very interested in your thoughts about the new Cold War. Now it's going to be China.
Mm-hmm.
You know, now it's going to be China. I mean, and I'm looking at my 88th birthday coming up. Hold on a second. Get this guy up. And saying to myself, well, I'm going to be 88 in a month or two. But is this what my kids and grandkids are going to have to deal with? Another one of these things? What's your thoughts here? I mean, what the hell? Here we go again. I'm not saying it's our fault or something, but isn't there some way? I mean, you tell us with considerable, I mean, obviously that Gorbachev had some real thoughts about moving ahead in a very constructive and peaceful way. What's your view of this latest thing with China? I mean, is this what our kids and grandkids are going to be dealing with? Another one of these things?
Well, let me try to answer that question in two parts. First, with respect to Gorbachev and the Russian-American relationship in the 1990s. A very dear friend of mine, I'm not going to use his name, but he was in a position, a civil power, said to me at that time, looking at the mess that Russia was in the mid-1990s. And he said, when you've got an enemy down, kick them. Never forget the expression, because my point was, why can't we, some of the things you've just said, why can't it, and Gary Hart has said very explicitly about this telephone system, why could we not at that point have reached out without jeopardizing America's national security interest, but looking toward a more creative way of strengthening those interests, of defanging all of the bad stuff from Russia and playing on the good stuff, because there's a lot of goodness there as well. It's not in a position of power now, but with Yeltsin, there was some possibility of that. We squelched it, and we began to move NATO forces closer, began to station them in the Baltic and in Poland. And the Russians have always felt, whether you're talking to a hardliner or a more moderate person, they always felt that that was a sign that NATO could never give up the idea of having forces directly on the border of Russia. And that is something they regard very negatively. The second point with respect to China, it is almost like as if we need to have an enemy, as if we cannot function in a world of positive opportunity, but require something negative against which we could rally our nation. At this particular point, I don't want to say I've given up hope. I am losing hope that we can come together as a nation and think about ourselves, how we come together before we come up with foreign enemies. I am not saying that the Chinese are doing everything magnificently, far from it, but we aren't either. And there is, in my judgment, still an opportunity using economic incentives and using the reality of certain common threats, like climate change, like the pandemic, like ordinary economic stuff, like a telephone line running through Siberia, where things are made better, where there are positives rather than the negatives. At this particular point, Mike, I think we're running down a dangerous sinkhole with the Chinese that is unnecessary. We as a nation have never, to the best of my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, we have never had a mortal fight with China. We've always managed sort of to get around, even to take advantage, send missionaries, economic missions, all of that. But we ought to be able to find, and I hope that this administration will still have the brains to find common areas of understanding. I'm sure they're trying. I know these people, I'm sure they are trying, but maybe not hard enough.
Jonathan, you said you wanted to add something.
Just before I mention something that Gorbachev said to me in an interview that directly addressed the question about Gorbachev, I just wanted to mention there's a kind of a, since Marvin was talking about Khrushchev, the man who translated his memoirs, Strobe Talbot, was actually the author of that NATO expansion that you just made reference to, that they considered so threatening in the 1990s. And on China, one thing I learned from Joe Biden when I wrote a profile of him for the New York Times Magazine in 2016 was that he had spent, I think he said this publicly, he had spent a tremendous amount of time with Xi Jinping when Xi Jinping was number 2 in China, and Obama sent him over to have the number 2s talk to each other. And so I don't mean to be Pollyannish about it, but I think if things go south a little bit, that's a bit of an escape route. They do have a personal relationship that was actually pretty good, but I'm worried, given what's going on in Hong Kong. I'm really worried that Xi is going to make a move on Taiwan of some kind or another, and so we really could have a crisis coming up. And since the Chinese assume, based on Afghanistan and other good evidence, that the United States has no appetite for foreign intervention right now, the possibility of them miscalculating, I don't think can be discounted. In answer to the question about Gorbachev, in the late 90s, Gorbachev came to New York and he was representing an environmental group. He was, out of office. And strangely, it was Take Your Children to Work Day. So I brought my 3 kids who were all, they were all under 10, 3 under 10, with me to my interview with Gorbachev. And I still have a picture of all of us, and people who see it in our house think it's a wax museum shot. And I said to him, I asked exactly the same question that was posed. I said, you could have kept the Soviet Union alive longer. The Red Army was in good shape. You could have easily maintained the Soviet Union for, another decade. Why didn't you? And his answer was really interesting. He said, to what end? And then he paused. And then he repeated it. He said, to what end? And I asked him, what did you mean by that? And he said, how would using the Red Army to maintain the Soviet Union have served the interests of the Russian people? How would that have made their lives better? And this goes to Gary Hart's point about what his vision was of a better society for the Russian people. And so he saw the continuation of the Soviet Union and the betterment of his people as at odds, and he chose the betterment of his people. And that's why I think he should be remembered as one of the great men of the 20th century.
And we'll quickly go back to Ben. Ben, do you have any thoughts? You're on mute.
Yep. If you're calling on me.
No, Ben wanted to say something before we went back to.
No, Bob, I don't. I wouldn't add, some of those insights. Jonathan talking to Gorbachev himself. No, thank you.
We'll go to Sandra, then James. Sandra, you're up. Thanks for being patient.
Oh, well, wow, this is quite a group for me to ask a question amidst. But I'm just wondering, given the somewhat earlier conversation about Kennedy, the Cuban Missile Crisis, if, Mr. Kalb, you've had the chance to read Marty Sherwin's book, Gambling with Armageddon, Nuclear Roulette from Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and if so, if you have any comments about that book, given your own experiences. And
there's one thing that strikes me as relevant not only to the book but to the larger issue of what actually was going on then and Khrushchev and the Cuban crisis. You can ask yourself the question, what then, that Jonathan was talking about a minute ago. Khrushchev was asking himself that question over and over again. What then, supposing we did this, would we be allowed to do it? Is there a way of advancing reform while still retaining our allegiance to communism? There was a collision there in the minds of a number of the more conservative Russian leaders. In Khrushchev's mind, it was doable. He wanted very much to solve one question left over from World War II. I keep going back to World War II because to Russian today, that is the beginning of their understanding of the rest of the world. It is seen through the prism of Russian sacrifice during World War II. In their minds, what was left over was the division of Berlin. Now, when Berlin was split in 1945, it was divided into 4 parts, which quickly, because of the Cold War, became 2 parts. The East, namely Soviet-dominated, and the West, French, British, and American, more or less dominated by the Americans. So it became part of the Soviet-American collision during the Cold War. And Khrushchev kept asking for a solution to the Berlin crisis. He kept referring to it as a bone in my throat. We must get rid of this. His idea, it is my very strong belief, and I will absolutely have this in this next book. Khrushchev did not want to attack the United States. He didn't want to use Cuba as a base to rip apart the whole eastern part of the US. He wanted a solution to Berlin. How do you get a solution? He had, in his mind, he had tried in 57 and in 58 and in 59. When he went to the US and talked to Eisenhower, he thought he had impressed upon Eisenhower the need to get something in Berlin. Now, he proposed a set of formulas for Berlin that we could not accept, but that didn't mean that that was the end of the discussion. But to the US, there was frustration. Khrushchev's not getting anywhere. Khrushchev looked at the US and said he was butting up against a stone wall. He had misread Kennedy. He thought Kennedy was sensible, but Kennedy is now turning out to be a hardliner also. I have to break the deadlock. His effort was to create an international crisis that would force Kennedy to have an agreement with him about Berlin. That was his, in my mind, his vision of a possible solution. And when we think about different ways in which Khrushchev could have been more understanding, I can give you 10 right now, but then I would not be realistic about the man. He was a special man living in his environment. He was not overly educated, but he was strong, he was tough, and he was a Russian, though he was born in the Ukraine. And that introduces a whole other issue, but that was the point I want to make about Berlin and Cuba.
Before we go to James, and thank you for being patient.
Well, first of all, thank you. And thank you, Marvin Kalb, for a truly remarkable discussion. A quick observation, partly in response to Jonathan Alter's remark about Taiwan. My take is a little more optimistic, which is that what happened in Afghanistan may reduce the risk, thereby essentially reducing the risk that the Taiwanese will move in a way that would dangerously destabilize the situation. If they don't move, I don't think the Chinese move at all. And if they don't have confidence that we'll back them, they won't move. So that's it's possibly a positive development. But on a broader, broader field of vision, it seems to me that it may be fair to say that even since the 60s, but certainly from the 70s onward, US policy made a point of playing the Chinese against the Russians against the Chinese, and being on one side or the other, but not not fostering what has now happened, which is a very close cooperation, in fact, practically an alliance between Russia and China. And with the collapse in Afghanistan, that's even more consolidated. So I'm wondering whether we're now in a position which is strategically the least sensible and the weakest that perhaps you've seen in the course of a very long period of observation.
Well, I'm not sure is the answer to your question. I'm not sure. I think that we're too close to the end of the American military involvement in Afghanistan to reach really large conclusions about the impact that it's had upon us globally. I think this is an area where the press and commentators on cable television have carried us too far. I'm not sure exactly the effect that the withdrawal from Afghanistan is going to have overall. I do believe that Taiwan is an area of excruciating danger because the Chinese could move, the Taiwanese could move, we could be obliged to move. In 1958, we came awfully close at that time, even to consider the use of nuclear weapons. It would never have been used, but it was part of the consideration until Khrushchev turned to Mao Zedong at that time in 1958 and said, dear friend, if you want Russian help, you want Russian economic assistance, back off and stop this Kimoimatsu business. And he did. Remarkably, Mao Zedong did back off because he did need the Russians. Whether the Russians and the Chinese today, as Jim was saying, are really as close as it appears, I frankly doubt it. I think history is too heavy with examples of how the two of them deep down distrust each other intensely.
Well, I think they've come to the position where they distrust us more.
That's probably true.
Yeah, both of them regard us as unreliable and not without very good reason.
I think that's a very good point, Jim. Thank you. Absolutely.
Next question, I'm going to kind of loop Gillian into this a little bit. And when, as we go back and look at Cuba and look at Berlin, when your husband wrote the speech for President Kennedy, announcing what became publicly known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the president asked him to write two speeches. There was one that he wrote, and then there was a second in a very famous exchange he couldn't write. Could you give us a little more about that?
Well, of course, I wasn't there.
Right. But, I'm sure he told you.
but I've heard Ted speak of it many times, and of course, he wrote about it in his own memoir, Counselor. They apparently, as I understand it, they received two messages from the Soviets. One was very belligerent, and it was also in very formal language. They assumed it came from the Soviet Department of Defense. The other was more personal, softer language, a very different tone, and they thought that was actually from Khrushchev. So I gather that the president did direct Ted, with some participation from Bobby Kennedy, to draft a response to the letters. And as Ted said, he wrote or drafted a response to that second letter, that is the more personal and conciliatory one. And they worked on that and on the language of that very carefully. But Ted said he did not and could not draft the answer to the other letter. And he said as much to the president.
Wow. Steve, your dad also was in the White House at that time too. I mean, was there a sense that missiles could come down at any given moment? Or was there a sense that there was, even amongst a heightened state of danger, perhaps a sense of stability, or perhaps an avenue where things could be worked out?
Well, my father was in New York at that time. He was the liaison between Kennedy and Adlai Stevenson, who was our UN representative. And frankly, both Bobby, well, particularly Bobby, and to a certain extent, Jack Kennedy, were kind of distrustful of whether Stevenson was the kind of person who could take on the Soviets over this issue. And they all came away very impressed the way Stevenson laid out with the photos from that have been taken from the U-2 flights over Cuba, showing the installation of these missiles. And they regarded that position that Stevenson took as one of the turning points in the crisis. I don't think Stevenson was really aware of these letters that Gillian was talking about, or if he was, it was very indirectly. But I think that the position that the way the Kennedy administration used the UN as a kind of arbiter between Moscow and Washington turned out to be a very valuable way of bringing down the temperature on that crisis. In any case, Stevenson came out much better than people thought he would. And, that is one of the high points of his own historical legacy.
May I add one other point?
Sure, please.
In 2002, and this I do remember vividly, I was there, the Cubans hosted, I don't know what other word to call it, a sort of reunion of the leading officials from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Consider how many decades later this is. And there were government officials and there were naval officers, and Fidel Castro was alive and well and hosting every minute of it. And Ted was there, and I believe Arthur was also there. I was there also, just as an observer along the edge. But the moment I most remember was the first morning. Fidel had welcomed people and then sat back for a couple of hours while people were talking. But then a Russian naval officer stood up, said something that made Fidel jump right out of his chair. And that was that naval commander said that each of the submarines had nuclear-tipped missiles, and that all that they needed to fire those missiles was the agreement or support of their number 2 officer. That's all, not a connection to Moscow or anywhere else. And Castro leaped up and he said, "You mean just your submarine could have blown up Cuba from the face of the earth?" And he was outraged, and he talked nonstop for the next hour about how he felt Cuba had been deceived and lied to, in effect, and kept out of such a vital decision. And it was a very intense and highly emotional moment, and a pretty interesting visit overall. It lasted 2 or 3 days.
Because the interesting thing is there was a PBS show called The Man Who Saved, I forget what the term was, but it was a number 2 political officer on one of the submarines, on one of the Russian submarines. Excuse me?
I think that's exactly
yes,
who they were referring to.
And they were, and how it almost reads from Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August, where things unravel where you don't see them unraveling. And all of a sudden you're in a place where, you know, the missiles are fired and people ask, how did this happen? And nobody knows why.
Yeah.
There's a great,
go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Please, Marvin, you're up.
No, I was just going to add, there's still a great deal of confusion, honest confusion, as to exactly who held ultimate authority for the use of a nuclear weapon to be launched at the United States. I understand the story that there was the local commander who had authority. That technically is accurate even for the United States. But in practice, no one, the captain on that ship would never have fired a missile without the authority of the military commander, the Soviet military commander in Cuba. Likewise, he would undoubtedly not have fired unless he had authority from Moscow. We're not really sure. All of the research that has gone on, the special program that had gone on at Harvard about 20, 30 years ago, when it's still going on, whether we know it or not in absolute detail, we were awfully close to a terrible disaster. And that was held up and put on a shelf because of the intelligence of 2 people, Kennedy and Khrushchev. They are the ones who stopped both countries from going to hell. And I take my hat off to them and to Gorbachev, what Jonathan was saying, a man of the 20th century, absolutely, without any doubt.
Well, we have reached the end of our 90-minute Luncheon Society, and this was probably one of the best, if not the best, that we've had. And Marvin, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We will make an advanced reservation on the next set of memoirs that arrive. I also want to thank Gary Hart, Mike Dukakis, and Jonathan and Ben for adding, and Gillian for adding their commentary to this. Has really added to a very wonderful conversation. So again, thank you very much. This was great, and we'll be in touch.
Picture, Bob. Picture.
Already. Okay. Well, we already took it. We're already there.
Okay.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Marvin.
It was terrific.
Bye now.
Just terrific.
Thank you, Marvin. That was marvelous, and everybody else who contributed.
This was fun, and I think
really good.
You know, I mean,
excellent. Thank you.
When you go back to Cuba, there's still you watch the evolution of history. For example, if you were watching the ABC teleplay Missiles of October, it misses out on a couple of things that didn't come out until the conversation between Bobby and Dobrynin that didn't come out till the mid '80s. And then you watch, the 13 Days, where Kenny O'Donnell plays kind of a narrator that connects the dots to the various various people. And you realize just how close things came to really going off the rails. And it's a miracle we didn't blow ourselves up.
So Bob, just one thing, if a few people are left. I did a piece about that movie 13 Days for the Today Show, and I interviewed Robert McNamara. And when he was describing what you were just describing, he went like this to the camera. He said, "We came this close to nuclear war." And I think he really believed it.
I think the movie that he talked about, I forget the title of it.
It was 13 Days.
No. There was a movie that he did, and I'm trying to think of the famous documentary filmmaker. It's
The Fog of War.
Which everybody entering government should see to understand that it's not a chessboard. It's a 12. It's like a 12 level chessboard, and you can only see one or two levels. And there are things that can happen that can really throw things asunder.
I want, if Bob, bear in mind, please, something that I mentioned earlier about Pakistan. Bear in mind, there are terrorist organizations there, many of them, who would like nothing more than to get their hands on just one of the 165 nuclear warheads there, just one, and put it into a suitcase and bring it to LaGuardia. I mean, we are in an incredibly dangerous time now. And I'm obsessed with the Pakistan story because I don't feel that anybody in government is fastening on to that. And they're thinking of China, rightfully so. They think of Putin, rightfully so. But it is places like that, like in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, that you're going to face the reality of the kind of world that we are all now part of. We can't forget that. And
yes.
Anyway, God bless you all.
Hold on.
Make me feel better by buying.
Before you go, though, to add to that, years ago we had Ahmad Rashid, who's a great Pakistani journalist, just speak to that directly. And we had him here in San Francisco, and this had to be 2002, 2003. And the big fear he stated was exactly that. He said, you know, there are parts of Pakistan that are he used the word civilized, yet there are other parts of Pakistan which cannot be controlled, or they have control of, they're controlled by terrorist functionalities, and they would love nothing more than they get their hands on a nuclear weapon.
That's right.
That's the, you know, it's
Bob,
almost,
Bob, I know we got to wrap this up, but I would love if we could continue this discussion at some point. And Marvin, I don't know whether you'd be willing to come back and join us, but I think this is absolutely a critical issue.
I think so too.
Yeah.
So
me too.
Well, we could do that.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really very grateful. Mike,
I know the guy who runs the Luncheon Society will be
great. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Marvin,
Bye-bye
thanks.
now.
A minute.
Right.